before we settle into the events of tonight. If you find yourself drawn to these accounts from the quiet edges of the world, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It truly supports our ability to bring these forgotten moments into the light. I am always curious to know where our voices reach. So please, share your location in the comments below. Now, let's turn our attention to the high peaks. My name is Elias Thorne. Before I recount the events that altered my understanding of the natural world, I served as a park ranger at Mount Shasta for over 8 years. Before I convinced myself that what I experienced was merely a trick of the altitude or a fatigue-induced dream, I feel compelled to share this account. I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know, with unsettling clarity, what still waits beneath 14,000 feet of volcanic rock. It was September of 1988, when the bells first began. By that time, I had been stationed at the Mount Shasta Ranger District since 1982. I arrived fresh from university, carrying a geology degree and a rather idealized notion of what protecting the wilderness meant. The reality, of course, was far more grounded in logistics. My days were filled with issuing permits, guiding visitors who had underestimated the terrain, and patiently explaining to spiritual travelers that camping on the summit was not permitted, regardless of their intentions to commune with history. Mount Shasta has always attracted a unique variety of visitors. While many come simply to witness the majesty of the mountain, others are drawn by older stories. They speak of the mountain being hollow, of an ancient civilization called Telos existing within, and of enlightened beings residing in cities of crystal beneath the earth. Over 6 years, I had heard every theory imaginable, from underground bases to lost continents. I had learned to listen with respect, nod politely, and keep my personal skepticism quiet. Yet, even a mind rooted in science cannot deny that the mountain possesses a distinct atmosphere. The way lenticular clouds gather around the peak, resembling disc-like formations, the lights that are occasionally captured in photographs, and the sheer number of people who lose their way on these slopes, it all contributes to a sense of the uncanny. In 1988, however, we viewed these disappearances as unfortunate tragedies and tried not to dwell on the statistical improbabilities. It was a Tuesday morning when Sarah Vance, my colleague and a senior ranger, entered the station with a report that would begin the unraveling of our routine. Sarah was 10 years my senior, a veteran of the service who had witnessed nearly everything the park could offer. She was grounded, pragmatic, and not easily unsettled. When she placed a file on my desk that morning, her expression was uncharacteristically troubled. She told me we had a strange situation. 3 separate groups of hikers had called in the previous night. All of them reported hearing bells. They described the sound as metallic and harmonic, similar to church bells but resonating at a much deeper frequency. The sound had lasted for approximately 20 minutes around midnight. I picked up the file and began to scan the reports. The details were immediately confusing. The hikers had been in completely different locations, one on Avalanche Gulch, another near Bunny Flat, and the third on the Clear Creek route. These locations were miles apart, separated by massive ridges and valleys. For them to have heard the same source, that source would have needed to be immensely loud and emanating from deep within the earth. I suggested it might be wind moving through the lava tubes, a common enough occurrence that can create strange acoustic effects. Sarah hesitated before responding. She told me she had heard them too, from her cabin. She lived 5 miles away from a mountain's base. She described the sound as immense, something that didn't just travel through the air, but seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. I looked at her carefully. Sarah was not one to indulge in the mysticism that surrounded the mountain. If she said she heard something, she had heard it. She explained that she had tried to record it, but her tape recorder had captured nothing but static, as if the frequency was somehow outside the range of her equipment. That failure of technology should have been my first indication that we were dealing with something beyond simple physics. But I was young and confident in my education. I assumed there had to be a rational explanation, perhaps seismic activity or the mountain settling. I promised to look into it, assuring her it was likely just geological movement. Sarah gave me a look that suggested she didn't believe that any more than I did, but she allowed the conversation to end. That night, I stayed late at the ranger station, sifting through years of archive reports. What I found was a pattern I had never noticed before. I discovered 3 instances in the past 15 years where hikers have reported similar sounds, bells, chimes, or harmonic tones originating from deep within the mountain. In each case, the reports have been dismissed as auditory hallucinations brought on by high altitude or exhaustion. But as I cross-referenced the dates, a chilling correlation emerged. Each time, exactly 2 weeks after the report of bells, someone had gone missing on the mountain. I was still sitting at my desk, surrounded by maps and files, when the radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m. It was Summit 1, the emergency shelter located near the top of the mountain. During the climbing season, it was manned by volunteers to assist with whether emergencies or injuries. The voice on the other end was breathless. They reported a situation they couldn't explain. They described bells, massive and resonant, coming from directly below them. They said the entire shelter was vibrating with the force of sound. I grabbed my microphone and asked if they could get a recording. The transmission cut to static for a moment, and when it returned, the volunteer's voice was trembling. He said it wasn't just bells. There was a pattern to it. It sounded like a language. I told him to stay inside the shelter and that I was on my way. I gathered my gear and headed for my truck. The drive to the trailhead took 30 minutes, and the hike to the summit shelter would take several hours more, but I knew I had to witness this phenomenon myself. As I drove, I called Sarah on the radio. She was already awake. She told me the sounds were louder than the previous night, much louder. We agreed to meet at the trailhead. We met at 12:30 a.m. and began the climb by the light of our headlamps. The night was exceptionally clear, the stars brilliant in the thin, cold air. Mount Shasta loomed above us, a perfect volcanic cone silhouetted against the vastness of the Milky Way. We were at an elevation of about 8,000 feet. When it happened, the bells began. I stopped in my tracks, Sarah right beside me. The sound was originating from below us, from the very core of the mountain. It was deep, resonant, and harmonic. It did not sound like brass or iron. It sounded like crystal, if a crystal could be the size of a building. The tones overlapped, creating complex harmonics that I could feel in my teeth and behind my eyes. It blurred my vision. Sarah pulled out her equipment to record, but just like before, the device picked up nothing but white noise. The sound lasted exactly 7 minutes. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was so abrupt it felt heavy, almost oppressive. We stood there in the dark, the echo of that impossible sound still ringing in our minds. Sarah asked me what it was, but I had no answer. Everything in my geological education told me this was impossible. Natural acoustic phenomena did not create perfect harmonic tones, and they certainly did not emanate from miles beneath solid rock with such deliberate timing. We continued our climb, reaching the summit shelter at 4 a.m. The volunteer, a young college student named Jake, looked exhausted and shaken. He told us the sound had stopped about 20 minutes prior, but before it ended, he swore he heard voices beneath the ringing. He described it as singing or chanting. When I asked if he recognized the language, he shook his head. He studied linguistics, yet he couldn't place it. The sounds were wrong, composed of vowels and consonants that didn't fit any known human speech patterns. We stayed at the shelter until sunrise, watching the horizon, hoping the bells would return so we could verify the source. They did not. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the summit in shades of gold and pink, I looked down at the mountain's southern face and saw something that made me freeze. There was a climber, perhaps 1,000 feet below us, on a route that no one should have been attempting. He was moving laterally across the face of the cliff, not ascending or descending. He was moving fast, too fast for safety on such terrain. I pointed him out to Sarah, who raised her binoculars. She noted that it wasn't an established route. I watched him through my own lenses. He was wearing modern gear, a bright blue jacket and pants, but his movements were wrong. They were jerky and uncoordinated, as if he wasn't fully in control of his own limbs, like he was being pulled by an invisible tether. Then, right before our eyes, he disappeared. He didn't fall into a crevasse or slip behind a rock feature. He was there 1 second, and in the next, he was simply gone. It looked as though he had walked through a door that didn't exist. Sarah lowered her binoculars, her voice barely a whisper. She asked if I had seen it. I confirmed that I had. We scrambled down to the location, a treacherous descent that took us 3 hours to navigate safely. When we reached the spot where the climber had vanished, we found nothing but a blank rock face. It was solid stone. There were no caves, no hidden openings, no deep fissures. But in the snow at the base of the wall, we found footprints. They led directly up to the rock and stopped, as if the climber had merged with the mountain itself. Sarah touched the stone. She remarked that it was warm. I placed my hand against it and felt it too. The rock was warmer than the surrounding stone, as if something had generated heat from within recently. And there was a smell in the air, faint but distinct. It smelled of ozone and something else, something sweet and earthy like burnt cinnamon. We spent the rest of the day searching the immediate area, sweeping back and forth, looking for any sign of the man in the blue jacket. We found nothing. No climber, no equipment, no explanation. That night, we filed a missing person report for an unknown individual. We described the blue jacket and the location on the southern face. The report went nowhere. No one matching that description had filed a climbing permit. No vehicles were left unaccounted for at any of the trailheads. The climber, whoever he was, didn't officially exist. 3 days later, the pattern I had feared began to manifest. A hiker named David Castle went missing. David was an experienced mountaineer, someone who knew Shasta intimately. He had summited the peak 17 times. He had filed a solo permit for a 3-day climb via the Avalanche Gulch route. When he didn't check in on day 4, his family called us. The search started immediately. Sarah and I led the effort, retracing David's planned route. We found his camp at 9,000 feet. It was perfectly set up, his sleeping bag still in the tent. His pack was there, along with his food and water. But David was gone, and on the ground next to his tent, lying in the dirt, we found his camera. I picked it up carefully. It was a high-end model, well cared for. The film inside was partially exposed. I took it down the mountain and had it developed that afternoon at a shop in Mount Shasta City, paying extra for them to rush the process. When I got the photos back and began to look through them, my hands started shaking. The first 15 pictures were normal. They showed David's drive up the trailhead and shots of the mountain from various angles as he climbed. They were beautiful photographs, the work of someone who truly loved this place. Picture 16 showed his camp at 9,000 feet at sunset. The tent was set up. Everything looked normal. Picture 17 changed everything. It showed a hole in the rock face. It wasn't a cave or a natural formation. It was a doorway. It was perfectly rectangular, about 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide, carved directly into the solid stone. The edges were smooth, almost polished, and there was light coming from inside. It wasn't firelight or the glow of a flashlight. It was crystalline, a blue-white luminescence that seemed to pulse. Picture 18 showed the same doorway, but closer. David must have walked right up to it. The light was brighter in this shot, and I could see something inside. There were geometric patterns on the walls, intricate lines that looked like writing. Picture 19 was the last one on the roll. It showed David's hand reaching toward the doorway. His fingers were inches from the threshold, and in the light behind his hand, deep in the background, I could see a shadow. Something large was moving in the depths of whatever lay beyond that door. I took the photos to Sarah. She studied them in silence for a long time, her face pale. She finally looked up and said we needed to find this location, based on the background landmarks in the photos. She estimated it was near where we had seen the climber disappear days earlier. It was the same area, perhaps 100 yards west. We agreed to go the next morning at first light. That night, sleep was impossible. I kept thinking about the doorway, the light, and the shadow. Everything I knew about geology said that doorway was impossible. Mount Shasta was solid volcanic rock. There were lava tubes, certainly, but nothing like this. Nothing carved with such precision. And the bells that came before people disappeared. I pulled out the old reports again and started mapping them. Every instance of bells sounds, every disappearance. The pattern was undeniable. The bells would ring for 3 to 7 nights. Then someone would go missing. It was always experienced hikers, always people who knew the mountain well enough to get to remote areas. It was as if the mountain was calling them, and they were answering. Around 2 a.m., I heard them again. The bells resonated through the walls of my cabin, vibrating the floorboards. I grabbed my recorder, but this time I didn't try to capture the sound itself. Instead, I placed a glass of water on my nightstand and recorded the vibrations in the liquid. The water rippled in perfect concentric circles, the pattern holding steady for the full 7 minutes the bells rang. When I played the video back later, the ripples formed something distinct. A shape, complex and structured, almost like writing. If writing could exist in 4 dimensions. I stared at the images until my eyes burned. There was intelligence here. There was purpose. This wasn't random seismic activity or acoustic anomalies. This was communication. But who was communicating, and what were they trying to say? The next morning, Sarah and I set out for the location from David's photos. We brought climbing gear, documentation equipment, and every sensor we could acquire. We found the spot at 11 a.m. It was the exact rock face from David's photo, identifiable by the cracks and lichen patterns. But there was no doorway, just solid stone. Sarah placed her hand on the rock. It had the same warmth, the same faint smell of ozone. I pulled out an electromagnetic field detector. The needle jumped immediately, pegging at the maximum reading. Whatever was causing these disturbances was right here, inside this rock. Sarah called me closer. She was examining the stone surface with a magnifying glass. Under magnification, I could see marks. There were tiny scratches in the rock, almost microscopic, forming patterns. They were the same geometric patterns I had seen in David's photo of the doorway's interior. Someone had carved this a long time ago. The weathering suggested thousands of years of exposure, but they were definitely intentional. I pulled out David's photos and compared them to the rock face. The geometry matched perfectly. The doorway had been here, but it was only visible sometimes. I suggested that perhaps the bells were the key, that maybe they activated something. Sarah looked at me with skepticism, asking what I meant. I explained the correlation. The bells ring, people disappear, doors appear and vanish. The electromagnetic readings were impossible. Something was happening, and it was connected to those sounds. Before Sarah could respond, we heard voices. Hikers were coming up the trail. It was a group of 4, dressed in what looked like ceremonial clothing, carrying crystals and flags. They were heading for one of the vortex sites that spiritual seekers often visit. Their leader stopped when she saw us. She asked if we were rangers, and then, with a strange intensity, asked if we had heard the bells. Sarah and I exchanged a guarded look. I asked the woman if she had heard them too. She nodded, her expression serene but intense. She told us she had heard them for 3 nights now. She called them beautiful. She said the ancient ones were calling, that the time of emergence was near. I bit back my skepticism and asked what she knew about the bells. She smiled and told us they had been prophesied. She claimed that when the bells of the inner city rang 7 times, the underground world would open. She spoke of ascended masters emerging to guide humanity into a new age. I asked her to clarify the number. 7 times? She was certain. She said it was written in all the texts she followed. She believed the bells were a sign of awakening. After the group moved on, Sarah pulled out her notebook. Her face was grim. She noted that if the woman was right about the 7 times, and this was night 3, we had 4 more nights, for more chances for people to disappear into whatever lay behind that doorway. She suggested we needed to shut down the mountain, to close it to hikers entirely. I asked her on what grounds we could possibly do that. We couldn't tell our superiors we believed in a magical door activated by bells from an underground city based on the word of a spiritual tourist. We would be relieved of duty immediately. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said we had to document everything. She proposed we return that night, when the bells rang, armed with cameras and sensors. If that door opened, we would be ready. That night, we set up camp 50 feet from the rock face. We had 2 tents, a full camera array, and sensors covering every frequency we could monitor. We also brought weapons, not our standard service equipment, but heavier items Sarah had retrieved from her personal collection. We didn't know what we might encounter, but the shadow in David's photograph made us wary. The bells started at 11:53 p.m. This time, being so close to the source, the sound was overwhelming. It wasn't just audio, it was a physical force. The vibrations traveled through my body, making my chest tight. I could feel my heartbeat attempting to synchronize with the harmonic pattern. And then, the rock face began to glow. It wasn't a bright light, but a faint luminescence, starting at the points where those microscopic carvings were. The patterns lit up in blue-white light, spreading across the stone like a complex circuit diagram coming to life. Sarah was filming, her hands shaking slightly, but she kept the camera steady. She whispered my name, asking if I was seeing this. The light patterns connected, forming the outline of that rectangular doorway. And then, impossible as it seemed, the rock face began to recede. It didn't open like a door or slide aside. The stone itself became translucent, fading, thinning until I could see through it. Beyond the stone lay a vast cavern stretching down into the mountain's depths. It was lit by bioluminescent fungi and strange crystalline formations that pulsed with their own internal light. This was not the City of Light, and crystal the seekers imagined. This place looked older, darker, and infinitely more solemn. Standing in the doorway, looking out at us, was a being. He was tall, perhaps 7 feet, with skin that seemed to shift between pale and translucent. His eyes were large and deep, holding an expression of profound sorrow. He looked at us as if he'd seen millennia pass in the blink of an eye. When he spoke, his voice was the bells. It was multiple tones harmonizing, creating words in the spaces between the sounds. The meaning arrived in my mind clearly. He told us we should not have come. He said the seals were weakening. He told us the bells called not in welcome, but in warning. He instructed us to tell our kind to stay away from the mountain. He said what they guarded must never wake. Then the doorway began to fade, the rock solidifying again. The being spoke one last sentence before he vanished. He told us that it was listening now, that it knew we were there, and that it was very hungry. The doorway closed. The bell stopped. Sarah and I were left in the darkness, stunned. We immediately checked our equipment. We had cameras full of footage that would change everything we thought we knew about the world. Or, at least we thought we did. When we checked the playback, every camera, every recorder, every sensor was blank. All of them had been running. All of them showed recording indicators. But the files were empty, just static. There was only one exception. Sarah's notebook. She had been taking written notes during the event. The paper was covered in writing, but it wasn't her handwriting. The letters were different, angular, in an alphabet neither of us recognized. And at the bottom of the page, in English, written in what looked like her handwriting but couldn't be, was a single sentence. 7 nights, 7 seals. What comes after must never reach the surface. We sat there until dawn, trying to process what we had seen. The being had said they were guarding something that must never wake. The bells were warnings. If I understood correctly, the seals were weakening. Something was waking up, and we had 4 more nights to figure out what to do about it. As the sun rose over Mount Shasta, I looked at Sarah. I told her we had to go back that night. We needed to understand what was happening. If that thing in the doorway was right, if we should stay away, then we were already involved. And if 7 seals were breaking, we needed to know what happened when the 7th one failed. I didn't know it then, but I had just committed us to the most difficult 4 days of our lives. Because what we had seen was just the beginning. The real challenge was still waiting far below in the depths where the bells were ringing. We spent the day researching everything we could find about the legends of the mountain. Most of it was contemporary spiritual material, but buried in the folklore, we found older stories. The indigenous tribes who had lived near the mountain for thousands of years had different names for what lived inside. They didn't call them ascended masters. They called them the Watchers. And they said the Watchers weren't there by choice. They were prisoners, bound to guard something that had come from the stars long before humans walked the earth. The tribal elders generally wouldn't speak of it. It was knowledge best left alone. But one elder, a man in his 90s, told me something that chilled me to bone. He said that when the mountain sings, you must not answer. He said the songs are beautiful, but they are chains. The Watchers sing because they must to keep the sleeper bound. But every song weakens them, and when they can sing no more, what they guard will rise. I asked him how many songs it would take. He told me the old story said 7 songs, each for 7 nights. After the 49th bell, the binding breaks, the sleeper wakes, and the Watchers are released from their duty, whether their task is complete or not. I did the math. We had heard bells on 3 nights. If the pattern held, we had 4 more nights. 28 more bells. Then the 49th would ring, and whatever was down there would be free. I tried to discuss reporting this to our superiors, to get the mountain closed, to call in experts. Sarah just looked at me. She asked what we would report, that we saw a magic door, that a tall, pale man told us something was waking up. We had no evidence, just a notebook with writing we couldn't read, and a story about ancient prisoners. She was right. We had to go back. We had to document everything we could, and if that doorway opened again, we had to go through it. We had to find out what was really down there. It sounded insane, but we were rangers. We protected this mountain, and everyone on it. If there was a real threat, we needed to understand it, and we had 4 nights to do it. That evening, we prepared differently. In addition to cameras and sensors, we brought climbing gear designed for cave systems, rope carabiners, harnesses, lights. If we made it through the doorway, we needed to be ready for anything. We also brought something else. Sarah had contacted a friend of hers, a professor of ancient languages. She had sent him photos of the writing from her notebook. He had called back an hour ago. He said it wasn't like anything he had seen before, but there were similarities to symbols found in extremely ancient ruins, scripts that dated back to before the last ice age. He thought it might be from a time before recorded history. We reached our position at 10 p.m. The rock face looked normal in the darkness, just another piece of Mount Shasta's southern slope, but we both knew what it could become. The bell started at 11:53 p.m., exactly the same time as the night before. The precision was unsettling. Whatever was controlling this operated on a schedule that didn't waver by even a second. The harmonics washed over us, and once again, the rock began to glow. The patterns illuminated, spreading like veins of light across the stone, and a doorway formed. The rock became translucent, then transparent, then simply absent. The being from the night before was there, standing in the threshold, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, I could see others, dozens of them, all tall, all with that same translucent skin and those deep, ancient eyes. The leader stepped forward. When he spoke, Sarah and I could both understand him, though I couldn't tell you what language he was using. The meaning disappeared in our minds, bypassing language entirely. He asked why we had returned against his warning. I told him we were rangers, that this was our mountain, and if there was a danger, we needed to understand it. Something that might have been a smile crossed his face, though it was filled with sadness. He told us that this had been their prison for 12,000 of our years. He said they had been here when our kind still huddled in caves, and they would still be here when our civilization was dust. Sarah caught the word. Prison. She asked if they were prisoners, and who had imprisoned them. He corrected her. He said they imprisoned themselves. He told us they were not the seekers of light and wisdom that people imagined. He called them the bound, the watchers, the last guard, and he admitted that they were failing. I asked about the bells. I asked if they were the seals. He confirmed it. 7 seals, 7 nights. The bells were the binding song. It was their collective will holding the prisoner in stasis. But they were growing weak. 12,000 years of constant vigil, never sleeping, never resting. Their numbers had dwindled. Once they were thousands, now barely 100 remained. And the song required a specific resonance to maintain its full strength. I counted the figures behind him. There were maybe 40 or 50 visible. Not enough. He continued, telling us that when the 7th night ended, the binding would fail. They would have failed, and it would wake. It would rise through the mountain. He described it as hunger given form, emptiness with consciousness. He said it was a thing our ancestors saw fall from the sky and correctly feared as the end of all things. Sarah asked him to tell us what to do. She asked how we could stop it. He told us there was nothing we could do. He said we were ephemeral, fleeting. The entity was eternal. The only reason they had held it this long was because they sacrificed their freedom, their lives, their very selves to the binding. They became the prison. Their bodies were the walls. Their minds were the locks. When they failed, the walls would crumble and the locks would break. I insisted there had to be a way, some way to reinforce the binding. The leader was silent for a long moment. Behind him, the other watchers whispered among themselves in voices that sounded like wind moving through crystals. Finally he spoke. He said there was one way, but it required willing sacrifice, a joining, if beings are sufficient were to bind themselves, as they did, to add their strength to the song. The seals might hold for another 1,000 years, but the cost was total. Those who joined them could not leave, could not pass on, could not be free. They would become watchers like them, eternal prisoners. Sarah asked how many it would take. He looked at us with those deep, sad eyes. He said, 20 more. 20 humans willing to give up everything they are and will ever be to hold a thing they cannot understand in bondage they will share. 20 people. 20 volunteers to become eternal prisoners inside Mount Shasta, singing a song that would never end. I told him we didn't have that authority. We couldn't ask people to make that choice. He replied simply that in that case, the binding would fail. In 4 nights, the prisoner would wake. He described what would happen next. It wouldn't be quick. It would feed for years, decades, consuming everything. By the time it finished, nothing would remain but emptiness, just void where matter used to be. The doorway began to fade. The bells were coming to their end. Sarah called out, desperate. She asked him to let us in. She said if we were going to convince anyone to help, we needed to understand the threat. We needed to see it. The leader looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. He told us to enter and to witness what they had witnessed for 12 millennia. But he warned us that once we saw it, we could not unsee it. The knowledge would mark us. We would carry it until we joined them in the binding. Sarah looked at me. I nodded. We had come this far. We stepped through the doorway just before it closed. The transition was immediate and disorienting. One moment, we were on the cold, southern face of the mountain. The next, we were inside, standing in a passage carved from solid rock with precision that made modern engineering look crude. The walls were covered in those glowing symbols, and the air was thick with sound. Not the bells anymore. This was deeper, a subsonic vibration that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The leader, whom we would come to know as Kalen, gestured for us to follow. We walked deeper into the mountain, leaving the world we knew behind, descending toward a truth that had been waiting in the dark for thousands of years. The moment we stepped across the threshold, the world we knew ceased to exist. The sensation was not like walking through a door, but rather like stepping through a heavy, invisible curtain of water. One moment, the cold wind of the high alpine night was biting at our faces. The next, the air was still warm and heavy with a scent I could only describe as ancient dust and ozone. Behind us, there was no sound of stone grinding against stone, only a soft harmonic hum as the rock face solidified, sealing us inside. Sarah and I stood motionless for a long time, our eyes adjusting to a light that had no source. The passage we stood in was not a rough cave or a lava tube. It was a corridor of perfect geometric proportions, the walls smooth and seamless, curving gently upward to form an arch. The illumination came from the stone itself, or perhaps from the intricate, vein-like patterns of bioluminescent fungi that traced the walls, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic blue light. It felt less like being underground and more like being inside a living organism, something that breathed and circulated energy through these glowing arteries. Our guide, the being who called himself Kalen, did not wait for us to regain our composure. He turned and began to walk deeper into the mountain, his movements fluid and silent. His feet made no sound on the smooth floor. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide, reflecting the blue glow of the walls. There was fear there, certainly, but it was eclipsed by a profound, overwhelming curiosity. We were standing inside a legend. We adjusted our packs, checked our breathing, and followed. The descent was gradual but constant. We walked for what felt like hours. Yet my watch, an old analog piece, seemed to be moving slower than my internal sense of time. Kalen spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice seemed to resonate from the walls rather than from his throat. He explained that we were traveling through the upper layers of the containment structure. He told us that what humanity called Mount Shasta was merely the capstone, the visible tip of a much older, much deeper construct. As we walked, the architecture began to change. The smooth tunnels gave way to vast, vaulted chambers that defied engineering logic. We crossed bridges of spun glass that spanned chasms of infinite darkness, where the only light was a faint, distant glow of crystals far below. In these depths, the laws of physics seemed to soften. We should have been experiencing intense pressure, the crushing weight of miles of rock above us. Instead, the air remained light and breathable, carrying a charge that made the hair on my arm stand up. It was in the third great chamber that we first understood the source of the sound. The subsonic vibration that we had felt on the surface was intense here, a physical presence that pressed against our chests. The chamber was lined with alcoves, hundreds of them, carved directly into the walls in concentric rings. In each alcove stood a figure. They were like Kalen, tall, pale, translucent, but they were motionless. Their eyes were closed, their heads tipped back slightly, and their mouths were open. They were singing. It was not a song of words or melody as we understand it. It was a single, continuous note, held with perfect, unwavering focus. Each figure sang a slightly different frequency, and together they created a complex, weaving tapestry of sound that resonated through the stone, through the air, and through us. Kalen stopped and looked up at the rows of silent singers. He explained that this was the battery. This was the energy source. The song was their life force, channeled into a harmonic frequency designed to bind space and time. He told us that these watchers were in a state of suspended animation, their consciousness entirely focused on the maintenance of the note. If they faltered, if their focus drifted for even a microsecond, the integrity of the containment would fracture. He spoke with a deep, abiding sadness as he looked at them. He told us that many of the alcoves were empty now. Where once there had been thousands, creating a choir of immense power, now there were gaps, silence where there should have been sound. The emptiness in the choir was the reason the seals were failing. We continued downward, past the silent singers, past structures that looked like machines made of light and thought. Kalen began to speak of his own history. He told us that his people had not always been subterranean. Once, they had lived under the sun, on a continent that sat where the Pacific Ocean now rolls. They were scholars of vibration, architects of sound. They understood that the universe was made of frequencies, and that by mastering those frequencies, one could shape reality. But their understanding came with a cost. 12,000 years ago, something arrived. It did not come with malice or hatred. It simply arrived, falling from the stars like a stone dropped into a pond. The impact shattered their continent, sending it beneath the waves. But the physical destruction was the lesser of two tragedies. The true horror was what the object brought with it, a hunger that could not be sated. Kalen described the early days of the calamity not as a war, but as a slow, inevitable disappearance. People didn't die, they vanished. Entire cities were erased from the map, not destroyed, but unmade as if they had never been built. The survivors realized that they could not fight this force with conventional means. You cannot strike a shadow. You cannot negotiate with a void. They realized the only way to survive was to contain it. They used their greatest science to build this prison. They hollowed out the roots of a volcano, using the geothermal energy to amplify their own harmonic technology. They lured the entity into the trap, and then sealed the doors with the only lock strong enough to hold it, their own living will. They bound themselves to the stone, to the song, and to the eternal dark. They became the jailers, and in doing so, they became prisoners themselves. Sarah asked him, her voice trembling in the vast acoustic space, if they ever regretted it. Kalen stopped and turned to us. His eyes, ancient and deep, held a complexity of emotion that was hard to look at. He said that regret implies a choice. They had no choice. It was this or the end of all things. The only regret they carried was that their strength was finally failing after so long a vigil. We walked on, the silence between us heavy with the weight of his words. The tunnel began to slope sharply downward, spiraling into the crushing depths. The air grew warmer, and the blue light of the fungi gave way to a sharper, whiter light emanating from ahead. We were approaching the core. The vibration in the floor became so intense, it made my vision blur slightly at the edges. Kalen paused before a final, massive archway. He told us that beyond this point, we would see the truth. He warned us again that the mind struggles to comprehend what shouldn't exist. He told us to focus on the sound, to let the harmonics anchor us, or we might lose our sense of self in the presence of the prisoner. I looked at Sarah. She was pale, her hand gripping the strap of her pack, so tightly her knuckles were white. But she nodded. We had come this far. We had descended miles into the crust of the earth, walked through history, and listened to the song of the ancients. We could not turn back now. We stepped through the archway and into the heart of the mountain. The chamber was a sphere of impossible size. It was vast enough to contain a small city, a hollow bubble deep within the earth's mantle. The walls were lined with the same geometric carvings we had seen on the surface. But here, they were enormous, miles of intricate script glowing with blinding intensity. The entire chamber hummed with power, a resonance so deep it felt like the heartbeat of the planet itself. In the center of this spherical void, suspended by nothing but beams of pure, focused light, was a structure. It looked like a crystal, but that word fails to capture its complexity. It was a fractal shape, constantly shifting, folding in on itself, rotating in directions that my eyes couldn't quite follow. It was beautiful, terrifyingly precise, a cage made of mathematics and light. And inside the cage there was a shadow. It was not a creature. It had no limbs, no face, no discernible biology. It was a patch of darkness that seemed to cut a hole in the visual field. Looking at it caused a physical ache behind the eyes, a sensation of vertigo, as if my brain was trying to interpret visual data that simply wasn't there. It moved with fluid, restless energy, pressing against the walls of its crystalline prison. Every time it touched the light, the containment structure flared, and the subsonic song of the watchers rose in pitch, a desperate counter-frequency pushing the darkness back. Kalen stood by the edge of the viewing platform, watching the struggle with the weary familiarity of a guard who has walked the same patrol for 100 lifetimes. He gestured toward the entity. He told us that we were looking at hunger in its purest form. It was not evil, he explained. Evil requires intent. This thing had no intent other than to consume. It was a cosmic anomaly, a pocket of entropy that sought to reduce complexity to zero. It ate matter, energy, light, and time. He explained the mechanism of the threat. The entity did not just consume physical objects. It consumed their history. When it fed, it unraveled the threads of causality. If it were to break free, it would not just destroy our world. It would make it so that our world had never existed. The memories, the records, the fossils in the ground, all would be wiped clean, leaving behind a smooth, silent void. Sarah stepped closer to the edge, mesmerized and horrified. She asked Kalen about the missing people. The hikers. David Castle. Where were they? Kalen's expression did not change, but the sorrow in his voice deepened. He explained that as the choir weakened, microscopic fractures appeared in the containment field. They were tiny, lasting only milliseconds, but for a being that existed outside of time, that was enough. It could extend a tendril, a momentary reach, through the cracks. It couldn't escape, but it could feed. It grasped whatever was near, a hiker on a remote trail, a climber on a ridge, and pulled them into its reality. So they were dead, I said, my voice sounding hollow in the vast chamber. Kalen corrected me gently. He said it was worse than death. They were erased. He told me to check my pockets. He told me to look at the evidence I had brought. With trembling hands, I pulled out the envelope containing the photos of David Castle. I slid them out. The first few photos, the ones of the drive and the trailhead, were still there, bright and clear, but as I flipped to the later images, the ones taken closer to the time of his disappearance, I gasped. The photo of the camp was fading, the colors washing out as if the paper had been left in the sun for decades. The photo of the doorway was barely a smudge of gray, and the final photos, the ones showing David reaching for the light, were gone. The paper was blank, not white, but devoid of any chemical impression. But the true horror hit me when I tried to recall David's face. I knew I had seen his driver's license. I knew I had spoken to his wife on the phone. But as I stood there, staring at the blank photo, those memories began to dissolve. I couldn't remember the color of his eyes. I couldn't remember the sound of his wife's voice. I couldn't remember her name. The concept of David Castle was slipping through my fingers like water, dissolving into the air. Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip painful. She was crying silent tears. She whispered that she couldn't remember who we were looking for. She knew we were looking for someone, but the name was gone. Kalen spoke softly. He said this was the nature of the enemy. It was eating the memory of the man because it had already eaten the man. The only reason we remembered anything at all was because we were inside the protection of the mountain, close to the source of the binding. Once we left, the erasure would be complete. David Castle would never have been born. This was the stakes. This was what hung in the balance. Not just death, but the total negation of existence. We stood there for a long time, watching the shadow push against the light. I realized then the magnitude of what the Watchers had done. They had sacrificed their own history, their own civilization, to prevent this nothingness from spreading. I turned to Kalen. The hopelessness of the situation was crushing, but my mind, trained to solve problems, to find routes through impassable terrain, refused to accept defeat. I thought about the choir. I thought about the empty alcoves. I asked him about the reinforcements. He had said they needed 20 people, 20 souls to join the binding, but he had implied it was a permanent sentence, an eternal sacrifice. Kalen nodded. He confirmed that once a consciousness joins the song, it cannot be uncoupled without breaking the harmony. It is a one-way door. But a thought had been forming in my mind, a jagged, desperate idea. I asked him why it had to be permanent. I asked if the song was energy and the singers were batteries. Why couldn't the batteries be changed? Why couldn't we create a cycle? Kalen looked at me, puzzled. The concept seemed alien to him. His people were absolutists. They thought in terms of epochs and eternities. The idea of a temporary sacrifice, of a shift change, had never occurred to them. Sarah picked up on my train of thought immediately. Her eyes lit up. She stepped forward, her voice gaining strength. She suggested a rotation. What if we brought 20 people to hold the line, to strengthen the song, but only for a set time? A year? 5 years? And then another group would take their place. A continuous, rotating vigil. Kalen was silent. He looked at the crystal cage, then back at us. He seemed to be calculating, running the variables through a mind that had observed the universe for 12,000 years. Slowly, tentatively, he nodded. He said that, in theory, the resonance could be handed off. If the transition was perfectly synchronized, if the new voices matched the frequency of the leaving voices, the seal would hold. He looked at us with a glimmer of something that might have been hope. He said it would be dangerous. It would require a discipline and a will that humans rarely possessed. But if we could find the people, 20 souls willing to walk into the dark and hold the way of the world for a time, it might work. It would not destroy the entity, but it would buy time, perhaps centuries. Enough time to find a permanent solution. The decision was made. We had a plan. It was fragile, desperate, and terrifying, but it was a chance. Kalen gave us a small crystal, a shard of the containment material. He told us it was attuned to the frequency of the doorway. When the bells rang, we could use it to open the path ourselves. We did not have to wait for the mountain to decide. We began the long ascent. The journey back to the surface felt different. We were no longer explorers. We were carriers of burdens so heavy it was hard to breathe. We walked back to the silent choir, past the glowing fungi and up the miles of smooth tunnels. We emerged from the rock face just as the sun was breaking over the horizon. The sky was a brilliant, indifferent blue. The air was cold and smelled of pine and damp earth, the smell of a living world. The door sealed behind us, the rock becoming solid once more. Sarah and I stood on the slope of Mount Shasta, looking out over the waking world. Below us, towns were stirring. People were making coffee, driving to work, worrying about bills and schedules, completely unaware that beneath their feet, a battle was being fought for their very existence. We walked down to the truck in silence. We had 3 days remaining before the final seal broke. 3 days to find 20 people who would believe the impossible. 20 people willing to leave their lives behind and become temporary wardens of a cosmic prison. I started the engine. Sarah looked at the map, her jaw set in determination. We didn't need soldiers. We didn't need scientists. We needed guardians. And as we drove away from the shadow of the mountain, I prayed that there were still enough people in the world who understood what it meant to sacrifice to the light. The bells would ring again tonight, and we had work to do. The drive down from the trailhead felt unnatural. The world outside the truck window was vibrant. Sunlight filtering to the ponderosa pines, the flash of a jay's blue wing, the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. It was a jarring contrast to the silent, crystalline weight we carried in our minds. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, the topographical map folded in her lap, but her eyes were seeing something else. We had 3 days, 72 hours to find 20 individuals who possess a specific kind of resilience. We didn't need physical strength, not in the traditional sense. We didn't need mountaineers or soldiers. We needed people who understood stillness. We needed minds that could hold a single thought without wavering, spirits that could endure the profound isolation of the deep earth. Kalen had been clear. The binding was an act of will, not force. We established a base of operations not at the ranger station, where questions would be asked, but in the back room of a small library in Mount Shasta City. It was quiet, dusty, and smelled of old paper, a grounding scent. We laid out our list of potential candidates. It was a strange list, compiled from years of interacting with the community around the mountain. We weren't looking for heroes. We were looking for the lost, the steadfast, and the deep listeners. Our first visit was to a man named Elias, no relation to me, a retired watchmaker who lived on the outskirts of Weed. He had spent 40 years repairing antique timepieces, working in silence with gears smaller than a grain of rice. We knew him because he often hiked the lower trails, walking with a slow, deliberate cadence that never changed. When we arrived at his small, cluttered workshop, the air was filled with the rhythmic ticking of 100 clocks. We didn't tell him about monsters or apocalypse. We couldn't. Instead, we spoke of service. We told him there was a need for guardians to maintain a balance, a task that required infinite patience and focus. We spoke of the mountain's history and the burden it carried. Elias listened, his loop still attached to his eye, magnifying his gaze. He didn't ask for proof. He simply looked at the mountain visible through his window, nodded slowly, and began to pack a small bag. He understood, in a way most wouldn't, that some mechanisms require constant, unseen attention to keep the world turning. The second candidate was a woman named Mara. She was a former cellist who had stopped playing publicly after a personal tragedy years ago. She lived in a cabin near McLeod, spending her days listening to the wind in the trees. We knew her hearing was acute. She had once reported a lost child simply by hearing a cry over the sound of a rushing river from a mile away. We found her in her garden. When we explained the nature of the task, the need to join a choir of silence to hold a harmonic frequency, she didn't flinch. She told us she had been waiting for a song that didn't end. She said the silence of the world had become too loud for her, and she was ready to be part of the sound again. By the evening of the first day, we had secured 5 volunteers. It was a slow start, and the tension in my chest was a constant, tightening knot. The sun set, painting the mountain in hues of violet and bruised orange, and I knew that deep below, the bells were preparing to ring for the 4th night. The seals were thinning. We returned to the mountain that night, not to enter, but to ferry our first group to the staging area. We used the crystal Kalen had given us to open the way just enough to let them through. Watching them walk into the rock face was one of the hardest things I have ever witnessed. These were ordinary people, a watchmaker, a musician, a librarian, a grieving father, a quiet young woman who worked at the diner. They walked into the dark with a dignity that humbled me. They were not marching to war. They were walking into a vigil. As the stone sealed behind them, I felt a faint shift in the air, a microscopic lightening of the pressure. The choir had grown by 5. The song was strengthening. The second day was a blur of travel and quiet conversations. We drove as far as Ashland and Reading, seeking out those we knew had the capacity for this specific kind of endurance. We found a retired lighthouse keeper who missed the solitude of the ocean. We found a monk who had left his order because he sought a more direct connection to the source of existence. We found a woman who had spent years caring for a comatose husband, sitting by his bedside day after day, holding a space of love and presence. These were people for whom time moved differently. They were not afraid of the long wait, but we were running out of time. By the afternoon of the second day, we had 12. We were still 8 short. The panic began to set in, a cold current running beneath my calm exterior. I looked at Sarah as we drove back toward the mountain. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, but her jaw was set. She told me to pull over at the scenic overlook. There, standing by the railing, looking up at the peak, was a group of New Age hikers we had met days before. The ones who believed the bells heralded a golden age. Sarah got out of the truck. I tried to stop her, fearing their fanaticism, but she shook her head. She approached them, not with authority, but with vulnerability. She spoke to their leader, the woman with the gray hair. She didn't lie to them. She stripped away the fantasy of crystal cities and ascended masters. She told them the truth, that the mountain was not a palace, but a prison, that the beings inside were not gods, but tired jailers, that the emergence they hoped for was actually an unraveling. It was a gamble of immense proportions. The woman listened, her face falling as the romantic veneer was stripped away, leaving only the stark, terrifying reality. But then, something remarkable happened. The woman looked at her followers, then back at Sarah. She asked if their meditation, their focus, could help. She asked of their love for the mountain. however misguided in its mythology, could be translated into the strength needed for the binding. Sarah told her that intention was everything. If they could drop the expectation of reward and simply give of themselves, they were exactly who we needed. 6 of them agreed. They weren't looking for glory anymore. The gravity of Sarah's words had grounded them. They saw the fear in her eyes and recognized as truth. We had 18. 2 more. We needed 2 more before the final sunset. The third day dawned with a heavy, gray sky. The mountain was shrouded in clouds, hidden from view, as if it were withdrawing from the world it threatened to consume. We searched for hours, making calls, visiting homes, but we were coming up empty. The specific resonance of character we needed was rare. We sat in the truck at the trailhead, the silence stretching between us. Then Sarah looked at me. She reached across the console and took my hand. She didn't say a word, but I heard the question as clearly as if she had shouted it. We were the ones who had opened the door. We were the ones who knew the truth. I shook my head, not in refusal, but in realization. I had assumed we were the conductors of this orchestra, the ones who had to remain on the outside to manage the rotation, to find the next shift in 5 years, or 10. But Kalen had said we needed 20 more. He hadn't excluded us. I looked at the mountain, hidden in the mist. I thought about my life, the permits, the paperwork, the quiet cabins, the lonely patrols. I had spent my life guarding the surface of this wilderness. Perhaps it was time to guard its heart. I squeezed Sarah's hand. We had found our last 2 volunteers. The night of the final seal arrived with a stillness that felt absolute. The wind had died down. The birds had gone silent, and even the usual rustle of the forest seemed suspended. It was as if the natural world was holding its breath, waiting to see if the exhale would ever come. Sarah and I stood at the base of the rock face for the last time. Behind us stood the group of 18, the watchmaker, the cellist, the lighthouse keeper, the spiritual seekers, and the others. They were a motley collection of humanity, dressed in hiking gear and warm coats, carrying nothing but themselves. There was no chatter, no nervous laughter. A solemn gravity had settled over them. They knew they were walking out of history. I checked my watch. 11:45 p.m. In 8 minutes, the bells would begin their final sequence. If we were not in position, if the harmony was not reinforced before the 49th bell rang, the cascade failure would begin. I pulled the crystal shard from my pocket. It pulsed against my palm, warm and rhythmic, syncing with the beat of my own heart. I stepped up to the blank stone wall. I didn't need to speak command. I simply projected the intent, the memory of the song Kalen had shared with us. The rock responded instantly. The blue-white veins of light traced their ancient path across the surface, and the stone dissolved into mist. The doorway was open. We ushered the group inside. As they crossed the threshold, each one paused for a fraction of a second, a final hesitation before leaving the sunlit world behind. But they all stepped through. The cellist, Mara, looked back at me once, a faint smile on her lips, and whispered that she could already hear the music. Sarah and I were the last. I looked back at the forest, at the dark shapes of the pines against the night sky. I breathed in the cold, sharp air, filling my lungs with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I wanted to remember it. I wanted to carry that scent with me into the deep, stagnant air of the underworld. Then we stepped through, and the walls sealed behind us with finality that echoed in my bones. The descent was faster this time. We didn't walk. We practically ran, the urgency lending strength to our legs. Kalen met us at the first great junction. When he saw the group behind us, his expression of eternal sorrow broke. For the first time, I saw something like awe in his ancient eyes. He looked at the 18 strangers, then at Sarah and me. He understood immediately that we were the final pieces of the puzzle. He led us down to the chamber of the choir. The sound was weaker than before. The hum was thin, fragile, wavering like a candle flame in a draft. I could see the empty alcoves, the gaps in the circle where the energy was leaking away. The watchers who remained looked translucent to the point of disappearing. their energy almost entirely spent. Kalen instructed us quickly. He explained that we did not need to know the song intellectually. The frequency existed in the physics of the chamber itself. All we had to do was step into the alcoves, close our eyes, and open our minds to vibration. We had to surrender our individuality, our memories of the surface, and become a vessel for the sound. One by one, the volunteers stepped into the empty niches. Elias, the watchmaker, took his place with the precision of a man placing a gear. Mara stood tall, her posture perfect, ready to play her part. The spiritual seekers, stripped of their ego, stepped in with humility. As each person took their place, a change occurred. The hum began to deepen. It gained texture and weight. The wavering stopped. Sarah and I walked to two adjacent alcoves near the center of the ring. She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of intensity. She reached out and touched my hand one last time. She told me she would see me in the music. Then she stepped into the stone niche and closed her eyes. A moment later, her mouth opened slightly, and a tone, pure and clear, joined the growing chorus. I stood alone for a moment. I looked at Kalen. He nodded to me, a gesture of profound respect. I stepped into my place. The stone was cool against my back. I closed my eyes and took a breath. I let go of the ranger station. I let go of the paperwork. I let go of the fear. I listened to the sound of the earth, the deep, grinding tectonic hum that underpins all existence. And then the sound took me. It wasn't like singing. It was like falling. The vibration rose up to the soles of my feet, traveled up my spine, and resonated in the center of my skull. I felt my consciousness expand, stretching out to touch the minds of the others. I felt Elias's patience. I felt Mara's grief and her love for silence. I felt Sarah's fierce determination. We were no longer 20 individuals. We were a single wave, a wall of pure intent. Deep below us, in the core chamber, the 49th bell rang. The entity slammed against the crystal cage. I felt the impact not as a physical blow, but as a spike of terrifying cold. A void trying to suck the warmth out of my soul. It pushed, hungry and ancient, seeking a crack, a weakness, a forgotten memory to latch onto. But there were no cracks. The choir was full. The fresh strength of 20 human souls, vibrant and stubborn, flooded the containment field. The crystal cage flared with blinding light. The geometric seals, which had been flickering and fading, snapped into sharp, brilliant focus. The song rose to a crescendo, a harmonic shield that wrapped around the emptiness and squeezed. I felt the entity recoil. It shrieked, not a sound, but a psychic tearing sensation, as it was forced back, compressed, and bound once more. The hunger was denied. The door was shut. Time lost its meaning. I don't know how long we stood there. It might have been minutes. It might have been days. I existed only as a note in a chord. I was the guardian of the threshold. I was the rock. Eventually, I felt a gentle touch on my mind. It was Kalen. He was pulling us back, dialing down the intensity, stabilizing the loop. The crisis had passed. The seal was holding. I opened my eyes. My legs felt weak, but my spirit felt incredibly light. I looked around the chamber. The others were opening their eyes too. We looked at each other, and there was a shared understanding that went beyond words. We had touched the infinite together. We were bound now, not just to the mountain, but to each other. Kalen stood in the center of the room. He looked stronger, more substantial. The transparency of his skin had lessened. He told us it was done. The cycle had begun. He explained that we would not have to stand here forever. The old watchers would teach us how to maintain the song in shifts, how to rest without breaking the connection. We had bought the world time. Sarah stepped out of her alcove and came to me. We held each other, exhausted but triumphant. We were underground, buried beneath miles of rock, removed from the world we knew. But as I listened to the hum of the chamber, now strong and steady, I realized I had never felt more alive. We are still here. We are the new watchers. We take our turns in the alcoves, holding the line against the dark. When we are not singing, we live in the quiet chambers of the deep city, learning the history of the world that was, and preparing for the next rotation. We know that one day, we will need to be replaced. One day, years from now, someone will have to come and take our burden, so we can rest. So, if you're ever hiking on Mount Shasta, in the quiet of the night, and you hear a sound like bells ringing deep beneath your feet, do not be afraid. It is not a warning anymore. It is us. We are singing. We are keeping you safe. And perhaps, if you listen closely enough, you might hear the call. Perhaps you are one of the ones who are meant to take the next shift. Until then, we will hold the note. We will keep the door closed. The world is safe for now, and that is enough. The first few weeks in the depths were less about adjustment and more about a fundamental restructuring of how we perceive reality. Time, as we had known it on the surface, ceased to hold any authority here. There was no rising or setting sun to mark the passage of days, no shifting shadows to indicate the afternoon. Instead, our lives became dictated by the rhythm of the song. It was a cycle of presence and absence, of sound and silence, governed by the needs of the crystal cage. We were given quarters in what Kalen called the Hall of Respite. It was a vast circular gallery carved from the living rock, situated a few miles above the core chamber. The walls here were softer, draped in the luminescent moss that provided a gentle twilight glow. It wasn't cold, which surprised me. The geothermal heat of the mountain was regulated through vents and channels that must have been engineered thousands of years ago, keeping the air at a constant, comfortable warmth. It smelled of ozone and ancient stone, a scent that eventually became as comforting as fresh rain. Our routine was simple but demanding. The choir required a specific number of voices to maintain a harmonic seal, but Kalen explained that human consciousness, unlike that of the Watchers, required periods of disengagement to avoid fracturing. We were divided into shifts. For 8 hours, or what we estimated to be 8 hours, we would stand in the alcoves of the binding chamber, adding our resonance to the collective hum. Then, we would be relieved by the next rotation, allowing us to return to the Hall of Respite to sleep, eat, and remember who we were. The experience of the shift itself is difficult to describe. Standing in the alcove wasn't passive. It required an active, muscular sort of stillness. I learned to visualize the sound as a physical structure, a cathedral of vibration that I was helping to hold up. When I closed my eyes, I didn't see darkness. I saw the geometry of the seal. I saw the complex, interlocking patterns of light that kept the hunger at bay. I could feel the entity pressing against it, a cold, insistent weight, like a heavy ocean current against a glass wall. But I also felt the others. I felt Sarah's unwavering clarity to my left, and the deep, rhythmic patience of Elias the watchmaker to my right. We were a lattice of will, stronger together than we could ever be apart. The transition back to normal life after a shift was always jarring. We would step out of the alcoves, our legs stiff, our minds buzzing with the remnants of the song. Kalen, or one of the elder watchers, would be there to guide us back, offering us a clear, viscous liquid that tasted faintly of honey and mint. It was nutrient-dense and restorative, clearing the fog from our minds and grounding us back in our bodies. It was during these off-shift hours that we truly began to explore our new home. The city, if one could call it that, was a marvel of preservation. It wasn't the gleaming, futuristic metropolis described in the New Age pamphlets. It was somber, elegant, and empty. There were libraries filled with crystal tablets that hummed when you touched them, containing the history of a civilization that had been underwater for 12 millennia. There were gardens where strange, pale ferns grew in hydroponic troughs, tended by automated systems that had never failed in all this time. Sarah spent much of her free time in the archives. She had found a kinship with one of the elder watchers, a female named Alara, who was a keeper of records. Despite the language barrier, which was bridged by the telepathic resonance of place, they communicated with a fluency that amazed me. Sarah was trying to understand the mechanics of the entity, looking for the permanent solution Kaylin had alluded to. She would sit for hours, her face illuminated by the glow of a tablet, tracing the history of the Watcher's sacrifice. I found myself drawn to the engineering levels. I wanted to understand how the mountain breathed, how the water circulated, how the air remained fresh. I worked alongside Kaylin, who seemed relieved to have someone to share the burden of maintenance. He showed me the ventilation shafts that spiraled up miles to the surface, hidden behind rockfalls and glaciers. He showed me the geothermal taps that power the lights. We walked through miles of service tunnels, and in those quiet walks, he told me about the world before the fall. He spoke of a sky that was a different shade of blue, of cities that sang with the wind, of a people who valued harmony above all else. He didn't speak with bitterness, only a profound, hollow ache. He explained that the entity was the antithesis of their culture. They were creators. It was the unmaker. Their sacrifice wasn't just about survival. It was an ideological stance. They refused to let the universe be reduced to silence. One evening, or perhaps morning, I found Mara, the cellist, in one of the acoustic chambers near the upper levels. She had found a way to use the natural resonance of the cave to create music. She wasn't playing an instrument. She was humming a low, mournful melody that twisted and turned through the air. A group of the New Age volunteers sat around her, eyes closed, listening. The fanaticism that had arrived would have been completely stripped away, replaced by a quiet, grounded spirituality. They weren't seeking ascension anymore. They were finding peace in the duty. Mara stopped when she saw me. She smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. She told me that the silence here wasn't empty. She said it was full of potential, like a pause before crescendo. She told me that for the first time since her tragedy, she didn't feel alone. The connection we shared in the choir, that web of minds, had healed something in her. She wasn't playing for an audience. She was playing for the mountain. As the weeks turned into months, a strange thing began to happen. The lines between the shifts began to blur, not in a dangerous way, but in a unifying one. We stopped thinking of ourselves as surface dwellers and watchers. We became a single community. The elder watchers, who had been so distant and ghost-like when we arrived, began to interact with us. They were curious about our world, about the birds, the oceans, the way we structure our societies. They were fascinated by the concept of change, something they'd been denied for so long. We held communal meals in the Hall of Respite. It was a surreal sight. 20 humans in hiking clothes sitting alongside tall, translucent beings from an ancient epic, sharing food and stories in the belly of a volcano. We told them about the stars as they looked now, about the shifting continents, about the resilience of life on the surface. In return, they told us about the deep earth, about the slow, intelligent movement of tectonic plates, about the song the planet sings to itself. But the reality of our situation was never far away. Every time the shift changed, every time we walked back into the binding chamber, we felt the cold pressure of the entity. It was always there, waiting, testing the strength of our resolve. We learned to recognize its probing. It wasn't just a physical force. It was a psychological one. It would try to whisper to us in silence, offering us rest, offering us oblivion. It would try to make us forget why we were standing there. We developed a technique to counter it. We called it the anchor. Before a shift, we would share a specific memory with each other. A sunset over the Pacific, the smell of brewing coffee, the sound of rain on a tin roof. We would hold that memory in our minds as we entered the alcoves, using it as a shield against the emptiness. The entity couldn't consume a memory that was shared and protected by 20 minds at once. One day, Kaylin took me to a viewing platform I hadn't seen before. It looked out over the core chamber from a great height. The crystal cage was pulsing steadily below us, a rhythmic heartbeat of light. The shadow inside was still active, still restless, but it seemed contained. The frantic, testing lunges against the walls had stopped. Kaylin looked at me and said that the song was stronger than it had been in 5,000 years. He said that the human element, our volatility, our passion, our stubborn hope, added a texture to harmony that the entity couldn't penetrate. We weren't just maintaining the seal, we were reinforcing it. He told me that he had been wrong to think of us as ephemeral. He said that while our lives were short, our capacity for renewal was infinite. We were the seasons, changing but eternal. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that felt solid and real. He told me that for the first time in millennia, he allowed himself to imagine a future where the cage wasn't necessary. I looked down at the light, at the prison we had chosen to guard. I thought about the world above, spinning through space, oblivious of the danger at its core. I missed the sun. I missed the wind. But standing there, watching the work of our collective will, I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. We were the foundation. We were the roots. And as long as we stood together, the tree would not fall. A year is a difficult thing to measure when you live in a place where the sun never shines. We marked the passage of time not by calendars, but by the cycles of a song. We had calculated that roughly 365 rotations of the shift schedule equated to a year on the surface. When that milestone approached, a quiet tension began to ripple through our small community. It was time to test the second part of our theory. It was time to see if we could leave. The plan had always been a rotation. Kaylin and Sarah had worked out the logistics. We couldn't all leave at once. The shock to the harmonic field would be too catastrophic. Instead, we would rotate in small groups. 5 would return to the surface to recruit the next shift, while 15 remained to hold the line with the Elder Watchers. Then, once the replacements were trained and integrated, the next group would ascend. The selection of the first group to return was difficult. Everyone wanted to feel the sun, but everyone also felt a deep, protective loyalty to the binding. We were no longer just volunteers. We were part of the mountain's immune system. Leaving felt like abandoning a part of ourselves. Eventually, it was decided that Sarah and I, along with Elias the watchmaker and 2 of the younger volunteers, would go. We were the ones who knew the recruitment process best. We were the ones who could explain the unexplainable. The preparation for departure was solemn. We spent our final shifts pouring every ounce of our energy into the crystal, overcharging the field to create a buffer. We spent hours in the archives with Alara, memorizing the protocols for the transition. The Elder Watchers gathered to bid us farewell. There were no speeches, just a shared resonance of gratitude and a promise to hold fast until we returned with help. The ascent was physically grueling. Our bodies had adapted to the higher air pressure and the geothermal warmth of the deep city. Climbing back up the miles of tunnels felt heavier than before. My lungs burned and my muscles ached, but the anticipation drove us forward. We reached the final seal, the rock face that separated our reality from the surface. Just before dawn, I held the frequency crystal in my hand. It felt different now, lighter, or perhaps I had become more attuned to its vibration. I focused my intent, visualizing the opening. The rock face dissolved, turning into mist, and a cold, thin air of the upper atmosphere rushed in to meet us. We stepped out onto the southern slope of Mount Shasta. The sensory overload was immediate. The sky was a pale, pre-dawn violet, vast and terrifyingly open. The wind was sharp and biting. The smell of pine and snow was so intense it made my eyes water. We stood there, 5 figures blinking in the gray light, shivering not just in the cold, but from the sheer scale of the world. After a year of tunnels and chambers, the horizon looked impossibly far away. We made our way down to the trailhead in silence. My old truck was still there, covering a year's worth of pine needles and dust, the tires slightly low but holding air. It felt like a relic from a different life. When the engine turned over with a reluctant cough, the sound was jarringly mechanical, harsh compared to the fluid harmonics of the underground. Driving back into town was a surreal experience. We passed cars, houses, people walking dogs. Life had gone on. The world had continued to spin, completely unaware that 20 people had vanished into the earth to save it. We stopped at a diner on the outskirts of town. We sat in a booth, staring at the plastic menus, overwhelmed by the noise of clattering silverware and conversations. The waitress asked us what we wanted, and for a moment, none of us could speak. We ordered coffee, black, just to have something warm to hold. Our mission was clear, but the execution required delicacy. We couldn't just put an ad in the paper. We had to find people like us, people with the capacity for stillness, for sacrifice. We split up. Sarah and I took the coastal route, heading toward the redwoods, while Elias and the others headed inland. We had agreed to meet back at the mountain in 2 weeks. The recruitment was different this time. We carried the weight of the mountain in our eyes. When we spoke to people, they listened. We found a retired fisherman in Eureka who spent his days staring at the gray waves, missing the solitude of the deep sea. We told him about the ocean of stone and the tides of sound. He didn't ask if we were crazy. He asked when we were leaving. We found a structural engineer in Portland who was tired of building skyscrapers that scraped the sky. She wanted to build something that would last. We told her about the architecture of the deep city, about the strain on the tectonic plates. She packed her bags that night. We found a young woman in a bookstore who was reading about ancient myths. She looked up at us as we approached, and before we could say a word, she asked if we were the ones from the stories. It turned out she had been dreaming of bells for months. The mountain had been calling to her, preparing her. It wasn't easy. For every person who said yes, there were 10 who looked at us with fear or disbelief. We had to be careful not to reveal too much, to protect the secret while exposing the need. But the resonance guided us. We could feel the potential in people, a hum that matched the frequency of the choir. By the end of the 2 weeks, we had found them, 5 new souls, 5 replacements for the first rotation. We met Elias and his group at the trailhead. They had been successful as well. We had a total of 10 new volunteers. It wasn't a full replacement, but it was a start. It was enough to relieve the most exhausted of our group and begin the cycle. The night we returned to mountain was clear and star-filled. I looked up at the Milky Way, sprawling across the sky, and thought about the entity that had fallen from those dark spaces so long ago. I felt a strange sense of protectiveness. The universe was vast and cold, but we had carved out a warm, safe place in the heart of the rock. We led the new group up the trail. They were nervous, full of questions, their flashlights cutting through the dark. I remembered how I had felt that first night. The skepticism, the fear. I stopped them at the rock face. I turned to face them, looking at each of their faces. I told them that what they were about to do was the most important thing any human could do. I told them that it would be hard, that it would change them, but that they would never be alone. I told them about the song. Then I opened the door. Walking back into the mountain felt like coming home. The air wrapped around us, warm and familiar. The hum of the walls greeted us like an old friend. We led the new recruits down the long spiral, to the Hall of Respite, and into the binding chamber. The reunion was emotional. The volunteers who had stayed behind looked tired, their light a little dimmer. But their smiles were radiant when they saw us. We introduced a new shift. We watched as the old watchers guided them to the alcoves, teaching them how to stand, how to breathe, how to join the harmony. As I watched the structural engineer step into her place, replacing a young man who had been holding the line for a year, I saw the color return to his cheeks. He stepped out, stumbling slightly, and she stepped in. The hum wavered for a fraction of a second, then stabilized, stronger than before. Her mind, fresh and disciplined, locked into lattice. It worked. The rotation worked. Kalen stood beside me, watching the transition. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. I could feel his relief radiating through the chamber. We had proven that the burden could be shared. We had created a system that could endure. Sarah took my hand. We were staying. We had decided on the drive back that our place was here, coordinating the rotations, acting as the bridge between the two worlds. We would go to the surface again, perhaps in a year, perhaps in 10, but this was our post now. I looked at the crystal cage. The shadow was quiet. The light was bright. The song was a river flowing through time, carrying us all. We were the watchers of Shasta. And for the first time in 12,000 years, the prison had a future. The long defeat was over. The long stand had begun. The years that followed the establishment of the rotation system brought a profound transformation to the deep city. What had once been a silent fortress of solitude began to evolve into something vibrant, a hybrid culture born from the intersection of ancient stewardship and human adaptability. We were no longer just holding the line. We were building a community that spanned two worlds, connected by a secret path through the stone. My role, along with Sarah's, had shifted from direct participation in the choir to the administration of the vigil. We became the keepers of the transition, the ones who ensured that the delicate handover of harmonic responsibility occurred without a tremor in the containment field. It was a task that required as much diplomacy as it did technical understanding. We had to manage the fatigue of the outgoing shifts and the anxieties of the incoming ones, all while maintaining the strict secrecy required to protect the operation from the outside world. The Hall of Respite changed the most. Where it had once been austere, it was now filled with evidence of human presence. The new volunteers brought things with them: books, instruments, seeds. One of the structural engineers from the second rotation, a man named David, designed a more efficient irrigation system for the hydroponic gardens, allowing us to grow things that tasted the sun: tomatoes, basil, peppers. The scent of fresh herbs mixing with the ozone of the caverns was a small revolution in itself. We also began to document our experiences. Sarah led this initiative, working closely with Lara and the other Elder Watchers to translate the vast crystalline archives into languages that the human volunteers could understand. We realized that if this project was to last for centuries, oral tradition wouldn't be enough. We needed manuals, histories, philosophies. We were writing the Bible of a new monastic order, one dedicated not to a deity, but to the preservation of existence itself. One of the most moving developments was the relationship between the humans and the Elder Watchers. Initially, there had been a respectful distance, a gap bridged only by necessity. But over time, curiosity eroded the barriers. I remember walking into the archives one day to find a young volunteer teaching Kalen how to play chess. The ancient being was fascinated by the game, by the idea of conflict sublimated into structured rules. In return, Kalen taught us about the geology of the deep earth, showing us how to listen to the shifting of the plates and predict tremors days before they happened. But the most significant change was internal. Living in the mountain, constantly attuned to the song, changed us. We found that our senses on the surface were sharper, almost overwhelming. When volunteers returned to their lives after their year-long shift, they reported a heightened empathy, an inability to tolerate noise and chaos, and profound, unshakable calmness. They became anchors in their own communities on the surface. Teachers, healers, counselors who carried a piece of the mountain's peace with them. We called them the Returned. We kept in touch with them through a network of secure channels, ensuring they were adjusting well. They became our scouts, our eyes on the world. They were the ones who identified potential candidates for the next rotation, sensing that specific resonance in others that marked them as potential guardians. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem of recruitment and service. However, the shadow in the cage remained a constant reality. We could never become complacent. There were nights, though we only knew there were nights by our clocks, when the entity would become restless. The crystal cage would flicker, and the air in the binding chamber would grow cold. In those moments, the community would rally. Those off shift would rush to the chamber, not to sing, but to stand in support, placing their hands on the backs of the singers, lending their strength through physical touch. We learned that the entity fed on isolation, and the antidote was connection. 5 years into the project, we faced our first crisis. One of the volunteers, a young woman named Elena, who had been struggling with the isolation, broke her connection during a shift. It was a malicious act. She simply panicked, her mind overwhelmed by the scale of the emptiness pressing against the shield. The harmony fractured. A dissonant shriek tore through the chamber, and for a terrifying second, the lights died. But before the entity could seize the opening, the Elder Watcher stepped in. Kalen and two others threw themselves into the breach, their own life force flaring brilliantly to plug the gap. Sarah and I rushed to Elena, pulling her from the alcove and stabilizing her. Another volunteer stepped in immediately, restoring the rhythm. The lights flickered back on, revealing Kalen slumped against the wall, his translucence perilously high. He had burned years of his remaining energy in seconds. That night was a turning point. We realized that we couldn't just train people in the mechanics of the song. We had to train them in the psychology of endurance. We established a counseling circle, led by a former therapist who had joined the third rotation. We created spaces for venting, for grieving the life left behind, for expressing the fear that we all carried. We learned that to be strong, we had to be allowed to be weak. Elena didn't leave. She wanted to, initially, ashamed of her failure, but the community refused to let her go in disgrace. We found another role for her in the gardens, where the tactile work of tending plants helped ground her. She eventually became one of our best recruiters, able to spot the signs of fragility in others because she knew them so intimately. As the decade mark approached, Sarah and I began to discuss our own future. We were tired. The constant vigilance, the weight of leadership, had aged us faster than the years on the surface would have. We looked at the younger leaders emerging from the ranks of the volunteers, people like David and Elena, and we saw that the system we had built was robust enough to survive without us. We decided it was time to take a step back, not to leave. We could never truly leave the mountain, but to transition into the role of elders ourselves. We would hand over the day-to-day operations to the next generation and focus on the long-term strategy. We wanted to find the permanent solution Kalen had dreamed of. We spent our days in the deepest archives, working with the most ancient texts. We were looking for the origin of the entity, hoping that if we understood where it came from, we might understand how to send it back. It was slow, painstaking work, decoding metaphors of light and sound from a civilization that had viewed physics as poetry. One afternoon, Sarah found a fragment that changed everything. It was a geological survey from the era before the fall, detailing a natural harmonic frequency that existed in the planet's core, a sound that the Earth made simply by spinning. The text suggested that this frequency, if amplified correctly, could create a repulsion field that would not just contain the entity, but push it out of our dimension entirely. It was a theoretical possibility, a whisper of hope from the past, but it gave us a new direction. We weren't just jailers anymore. We were engineers working on an eviction notice. The work would take generations. We would need to build amplifiers, retune the crystal cage, and train the choir to hit a frequency that had never been sung before. But we had time. We had built a machine made of people that could last as long as the mountain itself. 20 years. That is how long it had been since Sarah and I first walked into the rock face of Mount Shasta. On the surface, the world has changed in ways we only see through the reports of the returned. Technology has advanced, borders have shifted, climates have altered. But down here, in the heart of the world, the mission remains constant. The song continues. I am writing this from a hall of respite, looking out over the thriving gardens. There are children here now. A few of the volunteers from the early rotations fell in love, as people do, and decided to raise families in the sanctuary. It was a controversial decision at first, but Kalen argued for it. He said that nothing strengthens a shield like the presence of something worth protecting. The laughter of children in the stone corridors adds a brightness to the resonance that no amount of disciplined focus can replicate. They are the first generation of true watchers, born to the sound, attuned to the earth before they even took their first breath. Sarah is with the choir today. She doesn't sing as much as she used to, but she walks the rows, placing a hand on a shoulder here, whispering a word of encouragement there. She had become the mother of the mountain, the emotional anchor for 100 souls. Her hair is entirely white now, matching the robes we have adopted for comfort, but her eyes are as fierce and clear as the day she faced down the entity in the photograph. Our project to amplify the Earth frequency is progressing. We have begun to modify the acoustic architecture of the lower chambers, carving new resonance channels that feed into the core. It is the work of decades, chipping away at the stone to tune the mountain itself like a vast instrument. Every volunteer who joins us brings a new skill. A physicist helps with the wave theory, a mason helps with the carving, a mathematician checks the angles. We are building a cathedral of science and faith. The entity knows we are up to something. The shadow in the cage is more active these days, testing the new frequencies we are introducing. But it feels different. It feels less like a predator seeking a meal and more like a trapped animal realizing the walls are closing in. We are slowly, methodically, making our reality uninhabitable for it. Recruitment has become a subtle art. We no longer need to scour the coastlines for lost souls. The return have created a quiet network on the surface, a secret society of sorts, dedicated to the preservation of the balance. They run meditation centers, wilderness retreats, music schools. They identify the ones who have the gift, the ability to hear the silence under the noise, and they guide them to us. We have a waiting list now. People come to the mountain not to escape the world, but to save it. I often think about the day we met Kalen. I think about the despair in his voice when he told us there was no hope. I look at him now, sitting in the garden, playing chess with a 10-year-old girl named Maya. He looks solid. He looks content. The tragedy of his people hasn't been erased, but it has been transformed. They are no longer the lonely martyrs of history. They are the grandparents of a new future. We have had close calls. We have had tremors that shook dust from the ceiling and threatened to crack the crystals. We have had moments of doubt where the sheer weight of eternity felt crushing. But we have never broken. The rotation system holds. The human spirit, it turns out, is a renewable resource of incredible power. Tonight is the transition of the 50th rotation. A new group of volunteers has arrived from the surface. They stand in the intake chamber, eyes wide, taking in the bioluminescent wonder of the deep city. They are young, diverse, full of nervous energy. I see myself in them. I see the fear, but I also see the courage. I will stand before them in a moment and give the welcome speech. I will tell them that they are not entering a prison. I will tell them they are entering a fortress of light. I will tell them that the bells they heard on the surface were not a warning, but an invitation. I will tell them the truth, that the world is fragile, hanging by a thread over a vast darkness, but that we are the weavers who keep the thread from snapping. And then we will open the doors to the binding chamber. We will introduce them to the song. We will show them how to find the note that lives in their bones. And together we will sing. Mount Shasta looks peaceful from the outside. The climbers scale its peaks. The tourists take their photos. The seekers look for their crystal cities. They don't know that the real city is beneath them, a city of sacrifice and song. They don't know that the ground they walk on is held together by the will of a watchmaker, a cellist, a structural engineer, and 100 others who chose to stay. But that is how it should be. The best guardians are the ones who need no thanks. We do this not for recognition, but because we love the world too much to let it fade. So, if you are out there listening to this story in the quiet of your room, or on a lonely drive at night, pay attention to silence. If you feel a pull, a tug in your chest when you look at the mountains, if you hear a hum in the air that no one else seems to notice, don't be afraid. It might be us. It might be the mountain calling you home. And if you answer the call, we will be here waiting. The coffee is hot, the gardens are blooming, and the choir always has room for one more voice. This is Elias Thorne, signing off from the Deep Watch. The bells are ringing, and all is well. The 51st rotation brought with a quiet but significant shift in the atmosphere of the deep city. While the previous years have been defined by the steady maintenance of the status quo, the diligent preservation of the seal through the rotation of souls, this new era was marked by a growing sense of innovation. The project to amplify the Earth frequency, which Sarah and I had unearthed from the ancient archives, had moved from the realm of theory into the early stages of physical application. We were no longer just saying hold the door shut. We were learning how to change the lock. Among the new arrivals in this rotation was a man named Julian. On the surface, Julian had been an acoustical engineer specializing in the design of concert halls. He had spent his life obsessing over the behavior of sound waves, how they bounced off surfaces, how they decayed, and how they could be shaped to evoke emotion. When he arrived in the binding chamber and heard the song for the first time, he didn't just feel the spiritual weight of it. He saw the mathematics. He stood in the Hall of Respite during his first week, staring at the curved stone ceilings with a look of intense concentration, tapping a tuning fork against his knee and listening to the fade. Julian approached the elder watchers not with reverence, but with professional curiosity that delighted them. He proposed that the current configuration of the alcoves, while effective for containment, was acoustically inefficient. He argued that by carving microscopic channels into the back of each niche, we could create a feedback loop that would allow the singers to hear their own resonance more clearly, reducing the physical strain of maintaining the pitch. It was a small adjustment, a matter of millimeters, but in a system that relied on infinite precision, millimeters were miles. We gave him permission to test his theory on a single and used alcove. For weeks, he worked alongside a team of the Watchers, using laser precision tools adapted from the ancient technology. When he was finished, he asked to take the next shift in that specific niche. The result was immediate. The data crystal monitoring the output showed a 20% increase in harmonic stability, with half the bioenergetic expenditure. Julian emerged from his shift not exhausted, as was typical, but energized. He described the sensation as floating on the sound rather than pushing it. This breakthrough sparked a renaissance of engineering in the deep city. Suddenly, everyone looked at our stone home with new eyes. A botanist from the 49th rotation realized that the root systems of the hydroponic plants could be arranged to filter the air more effectively, creating a cleaner oxygen cycle that sharpened the mind. A weaver from the surface taught the community how to create tapestries that absorb stray echoes in the living quarters, making the silence of our rest periods deeper and more restorative. We were optimizing our existence, turning the mountain into a finely tuned instrument of life. Sarah took charge of the integration of these new methods. She moved through the halls with a renewed lightness in her step. For years, she had carried the burden of our survival like a heavy stone, but now she saw a future where the burden didn't just get lighter, it became sustainable indefinitely. She organized workshops where the surface volunteers and the elder watchers exchanged knowledge. It was a beautiful thing to witness. The intuitive, fluid wisdom of the ancients blending with the structured, innovative problem-solving of humanity. One evening, I found Julian and Kaylin deep in conversation near the central core. They were discussing the resonance of the planet itself. Julian was explaining the concept of sympathetic vibration, using a diagram drawn in the dust. Kaylin was nodding slowly, his large eyes reflecting the pulsing light of the crystal cage. They were discussing the possibility of tuning the song not just to block the entity, but to harmonize with the tectonic plates of the earth. If we could achieve that, the mountain wouldn't just be a localized shield. It would draw strength from the rotation of the planet itself. The entity would be fighting gravity. It would be fighting the momentum of the world. It was a staggering concept. It meant that we wouldn't just be 20 people and a few dozen watchers holding the line. We would be the focal point for the energy of the entire globe. The preparations for such a shift would take years, perhaps decades, of careful calibration. We would need to slowly adjust the pitch of the choir, microtone by microtone, until we matched the Earth's frequency. But for the first time, we had a map. We weren't just treading water. We were swimming toward a shore. As these technical advancements unfolded, the emotional landscape of the city deepened. The children born in the early years of the rotation were growing up, They were teenagers now, bright-eyed and serious, moving through the corridors with a grace that belonged to the stone. They didn't know the surface world except through our stories and the archives. To them, the sun was a myth, a bright legend, while the bioluminescent glow of the moss was a reality of home. There was a debate among the council about whether these children should be sent to the surface. Was it fair to keep them here? But when we offered the choice to the eldest, a girl named Alara, named after the archivist, she refused. She said her place was here. She could hear the entity in the cage. Yes, but she could also hear the song of the roots growing in the dark. She said the surface sounded chaotic to her, a place of noise and disconnection. She wanted to be a watcher. She wanted to be the first of a generation that didn't have to learn the song, because the song was already in her blood. We realized then that we were becoming a distinct culture. We were no longer just surface dwellers hiding underground. We were the people of the mountain. We had our own art, carved into the spare rock, our own music, played on instruments made of crystal and wire, our own cuisine, simple but rich with the flavors of the deep earth. We celebrated the changing of the rotations like high holidays, festivals of welcome and farewell that lasted for days. The shadow in the cage seemed to sense this growing solidarity. Its movements became less erratic, more sluggish. The new acoustic efficiency meant the walls of its prison were harder, smoother, more impenetrable. It was no longer probing for cracks, because there were no cracks to find. The hunger was still there, vast and terrifying, but was being starved. The connection between the singers had become a seamless web, a fabric of consciousness so tight that not even a thought could slip through. I spent my days documenting this evolution. I wrote about Julian's acoustic channels, about the children's laughter in the gardens, about the way Sarah looked when she watched the choir sing, like a conductor watching her symphony achieve perfection. I realized that my journal was no longer a log of survival. It was the history of a civilization. We had come here to stop the end of the world, but in the process, we had built a new one. The 51st rotation ended not with relief, but with a sense of accomplishment. When the new volunteers arrived, they didn't walk into a desperate bunker. They walked into a thriving, humming sanctuary. They saw the gardens, the art, the quiet confidence of the community, and their fear evaporated. They realized they hadn't been drafted into a war. They had been invited to join a masterpiece. And as I watched Julian show a new recruit how to listen to the walls, I knew that the song would go on clearer and stronger than ever before. The transition to the Earth resonance, as we came to call it, was a defining project of the next decade. It was not a task that could be rushed. The planet is a massive, slowly moving object, and its vibrational frequency is incredibly deep, far below the range of human hearing. To tune our choir to that pitch required a fundamental retraining of how we produce sound and how we focused our intent. We weren't just learning a new note. We were learning how to vibrate our very bones in sympathy with the crust of the world. Sarah was the heart of this transition. She worked tirelessly with the counseling circle and the meditation guides to prepare the volunteers for the psychological shift. Connecting to the earth frequency meant opening oneself up to a sensation of immense heaviness and immense time. It meant feeling the slow grind of the continental plates, the pressure of the magma flows, the deep, dark silence of the ocean trenches. For a human mind used to the frantic pace of seconds and minutes, this was disorienting. It induced a kind of vertigo, a feeling of being small and insignificant against the scale of geology. Sarah developed a series of grounding exercises. She taught us to visualize ourselves not as separate beings standing on the rock, but as extensions of the rock itself, like stalagmites growing from the floor. She taught us to slow our breathing until it matched the rhythmic pulse of the ventilation shafts. "You are not singing to the mountain," she would say during the morning assemblies. "You are letting the mountain sing through you." The physical modifications to the binding chamber were equally extensive. Under Julian's direction, the watchers and the human engineers carved deep, fluted grooves into the floor of the chamber, arranged in a spiral pattern that radiated outward from the central core. These grooves acted as waveguides, channeling the subsonic frequencies from the Earth's mantle up into the crystal cage. It was delicate, dangerous work. One wrong chisel strike could destabilize the acoustics of the room. But the team worked with a synchronized focus that bordered on the telepathic. I remember the day we first attempted to engage the full resonance. It was the winter solstice on the surface, a time when the Earth is quietest. We had spent months practicing the new harmonic progression, a series of tones that descended lower and lower until they became less of a sound and more of a shudder in the air. The entire community gathered in the chamber, the choir in the alcoves, the rest of us standing in the spiral grooves on the floor, holding hands, creating a human circuit. Kaylin gave the signal. The choir began to descend. The sound started in the familiar range, a clear, bright hum, but then it began to drop. It went deeper, past the range of the cello, past the rumble of thunder, down into the felt vibration of the infrasound. I felt it in the soles of my feet first, a tingling that rose up through my legs and settled in my solar plexus. The air in the chamber seemed to thicken, becoming viscous and heavy. Then we hit the frequency. It was a sensation unlike anything I had ever experienced. It felt as if the floor had dropped away, and we were floating in the center of the planet. There was a profound sense of connection, a sudden awareness of the sheer mass of the globe. And then the response came. It wasn't a sound from the choir. It was an echo from below. The Earth answered. A massive, rolling wave of energy rose up through the waveguides, amplified by the new carvings, and flooded into the crystal cage. The effect on the entity was instantaneous. For years, the shadow had been a localized knot of darkness, pressing against the glass. But when the Earth resonance hit it, the shadow seemed to lose its cohesion. It smeared, stretched thin, and was pushed back toward the very center of the singularity. The crystal cage flared with a light, so intense we had to close our eyes. But it wasn't a harsh light. It was warm, golden, the color of molten rock. The entity wasn't just being contained. It was being overwhelmed by the sheer vitality of the planet. We held the note for an hour. When silence finally returned, it was different. It wasn't the empty silence of a vacuum. It was a pregnant, heavy silence of a seed waiting to sprout. We looked at each other, sweat dripping from our faces, exhausted but exhilaratingly alive. We had done it. We had anchored the cage to the world. The success of the Earth resonance changed the nature of our vigil. The strain on the volunteers was significantly reduced because the planet was doing the heavy lifting. The choir only needed to guide and shape the energy, rather than generating it entirely from their own life force. Shifts became shorter, less draining. The burnout that we had feared in the early years became a thing of the past. We had moved from a sprint to a marathon, and now we were walking. This new stability allowed us to turn our attention outward again. The network of the return on the surface had been growing steadily. They had established quiet sanctuaries in the mountains, in the deserts, places where people could go to learn the techniques of stillness we had perfected. We realized that we could export the Earth resonance. We could teach people on the surface how to tune into this frequency, how to ground themselves in the stability of the planet. We began to send out resonance crystals, small, non-functional shards of the mountain stone that had absorbed the vibration of the chamber. These weren't magical objects, but physical reminders, tactile anchors that helped the return teach their students. We were spreading a web of calm across a chaotic world. We like to think that every person who learned to breathe with the Earth was adding a tiny fraction of strength to the shield, no matter where they were. Sarah and I spent our evenings on the observation deck, watching the golden light of the core. We were old now. My hands were stiff, and Sarah walked with a cane carved from petrified wood. But we had never felt more at peace. We had arrived at the mountain terrified at the end of the world, and instead we had found its heartbeat. One night, Kalen joined us. He looked at the golden light and said that in all the history of his people, they had never thought to ask the planet for help. They had always believed that they had to stand alone, that their technology and their will were the only things that mattered. He told us that humanity's greatest gift wasn't our strength, but our ability to connect, to find allies in the unlikeliest of places. even the rocks beneath our feet. He pointed to the shadow, now just a small dent set in the center of the brilliance. It is sleeping, he said. For the first time in 12 millennia, the hunger is asleep. It is lulled by the turning of the world. We sat there for a long time, the three of us, the ancient guardian and the two aging rangers, listening to the deep, steady thrum of the earth resonance. It was a lullaby for a monster and a hymn for the future. We knew that our time as the leaders of this community was coming to an end. The next generation, the children of the mountain and the brilliant minds like Julian, were ready to take the helm. But we weren't sad. We had built something that would outlast us. We had turned a prison into a fortress, and a fortress into a temple. As the golden light bathed our faces, I reached out and took Sarah's hand. We didn't need to speak. We just breathed in and out in perfect time with the slow, eternal spin of the world. The watch continued, but the fear was gone. We were grounded. We were home. The 63rd rotation was marked not by a technological breakthrough or a geological shift, but by a quiet, inevitable human transition. Sarah and I, the first of the surface guardians, the ones who had walked into the mountain with nothing but fear and a notebook, were finally stepping down. It wasn't a decision forced upon us by illness or failure, but a choice born of wisdom. We had seen the seasons of the deep city turn 63 times. We had watched the black hair of our youth turn to the white of winter snow. Our bodies, though sustained by the vitality of the resonance, were simply tired. The mountain demands a vitality that belongs to the young, or at least to those who still have many years to give. The process of succession had begun years earlier, almost imperceptibly. We had been mentoring our replacements, slowly transferring the weight of leadership so that when the moment came, it would feel less like an ending and more like continuation. Julian, the acoustical engineer who had revolutionized the choir, would take my place as the keeper of the resonance. Elena, the woman who had once faltered but found her strength in the gardens, would take Sarah's place as the keeper of the community. They were ready. In many ways, they were better suited for the future than we were. They were children of the innovation era, unburdened by the trauma of the early days. The ceremony of succession was held in the Hall of Respite. It was a simple affair, devoid of pomp but heavy with significance. The entire community gathered, the current rotation of volunteers, the elder watchers, the children born in the stone. Even the retired sent messages through the secure channels, words of gratitude and love from the surface world that echoed through the cavern. I stood before them, my hand resting on the smooth, cool stone of the podium. I looked out the faces, some familiar, some new, and I felt a swell of pride that nearly brought me to my knees. We had done it. We had taken a desperate, impossible situation and turned it into a thriving, enduring society. I spoke briefly, telling them that the greatest honor of my life wasn't saving the world, but knowing them. I handed Julian the master key, a heavy crystal shard that controlled the primary access to the core chamber. He took it with trembling hands, his eyes wet, promising to hold the note true. Sarah spoke next. Her voice was softer now, raspy with age, but still carried that undeniable steel. She spoke to Elena, giving her the journal of the first days, the original notebook she had carried into the mountain all those years ago. "This is the memory," she said. "Don't let us forget where we came from, but don't let the past weigh you down. The mountain changes, and so must we." That evening, for the first time in decades, Sarah and I did not have a duty roster to check. We did not have to monitor the harmonic outputs or review the recruitment logs. We were just two old friends, sitting in our quarters, drinking tea made from the herbs grown in the hydroponic gardens. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with the shared history of a lifetime spent underground. We talked about the surface. We hadn't been back since that recruitment drive 40 years ago. We wondered what it looked like now. We wondered if the trees had grown tall in the spots we used to hike. We wondered if the world was still as loud and chaotic as we remembered. We had decided that we would not return. Our bodies had adapted too completely to the deep environment. The gravity and atmosphere of the surface would likely be too much for us now. We would finish our days here, in the sanctuary we had built. We would become the first human ancestors of the deep city, buried in the stone when our time came, joining the mountain in the most literal sense. The days following succession were strange but peaceful. I found myself spending hours in the archives, finally having the time to read the texts I had only skimmed before. I learned about the poetry of the ancient watchers, about their philosophy of living light. I realized that Kalen and his people were not just scientists. They were artists who used reality as their canvas. Sarah spent her time with the children. She became the storyteller of the city. Every afternoon, a group of wide-eyed kids would gather around her chair in the garden, and she would tell them stories of the surface, of oceans that stretched forever, of birds that could fly higher than the mountain, of the feeling of rain on your face. She was keeping the memory of the blue sky alive for a generation that had never seen it. One day, Kalen came to find me. He asked me to walk with him to the viewing platform overlooking the core. We stood there, two old soldiers, watching the golden light of the Earth resonance pulsing steadily below. The entity was dormant, a small, dark blemish in the center of the brilliance, utterly contained. Kalen told me that the Elder Watchers had held a council. They had decided to grant Sarah and me a gift. It was rare, something that had only been done a handful of times in their history. They offered to teach us the final harmony. It was a meditative technique that would allow us, when our time eventually came, to bypass the fate of death and merge our consciousness directly with the song. We wouldn't just be buried in the rock. We would become part of the frequency that held the world together. We would become eternal guardians, not in body, but in spirit. I looked at him, overwhelmed. To become part of song, it was the ultimate belonging. It meant we would never leave. We would be the wind in the tunnels, the hum in the crystal, the whisper of comfort to the frightened volunteer on their first shift. I accepted, and I knew without asking that Sarah would too. The torch had been passed. The new generation was strong, capable, and full of hope, and we, the old guard, were preparing for our final transformation. We weren't fading away. We were just changing our tune. We were moving from the melody to the bass line, the deep, unseen foundation that holds the music up. 10 years after the succession, the deep city faced a new kind of challenge. Not a threat from the entity, but a question of expansion. The population of the sanctuary had grown. The families were getting larger, and the number of volunteers who chose to stay permanently after their rotation was increasing. The original Hall of Respite was becoming crowded. The hydroponic gardens were being pushed to their limits to feed everyone. We were running out of room. Julian and Elena brought the issue to the council. They proposed a daring plan to open up the lower levels. Below the binding chamber, there were vast, unexplored cavern systems that the ancient texts hinted at, but that had been sealed off for millennia. The text described them as the echoing deep, a place where the acoustics were so perfect that a single whisper could travel for miles. The Elder Watchers were hesitant. Those levels had been closed for a reason. They were too close to the raw magma flows, too wild, too unpredictable. But Julian argued that with our new understanding of the Earth resonance, we could stabilize those caverns. We could harness the thermal energy to power a significant expansion of the city. We could build new living quarters, new gardens, even a great hall for communal gatherings. The debate lasted for weeks. It was a sign of how far we had come that the discussion was open, democratic, and heated. In the early days, we would have simply followed Kalen's word. Now, the humans and the Watchers argued as equals. Sarah and I watched from the sidelines, offering advice only when asked, trusting the leaders we had trained to find the right path. Eventually, a compromise was reached. They would send a scouting party, a mixed team of human engineers and Elder Watchers, to assess the stability of the echoing deep. If the resonance readings were safe, they would begin a slow, careful expansion. The day the scouting party returned was a day of celebration. They brought back samples of rock that glittered with rare minerals and recordings of the acoustic properties of the caverns that sounded like whale song. They reported that the thermal vents were stable and could be tapped. The expansion was approved. The next 5 years were a flurry of activity. The sound of chisels and laser cutters rang through the lower levels. It was a new sound for the mountain, the sound of growth. We weren't just hiding anymore, we were thriving. We were building a metropolis in the dark. I visited the new construction site often. It was breathtaking. The architects, young men and women born in the city, were designing structures that blended organic curves with the sharp geometry of the ancient style. They were building bridges over magma rivers, carving amphitheaters into natural acoustic bowls, creating vertical gardens that spiraled up the walls of massive lava tubes. It was beautiful. It was a testament to the resilience of life. During this time, Sarah's health began to decline. The years had finally caught up with her. She moved slower, her breathing became labored, and she spent more time in her quarters. But her spirit remained undimmed. She held court in her room, receiving visitors, offering advice, and listening to the reports of the expansion with a gleam in her eye. We spent our evenings practicing the final harmony. It was a difficult discipline, requiring us to untether our minds from our physical sensations and focus entirely on the vibration of existence. It was like learning to fall asleep while staying awake. Slowly, night by night, we began to feel the edges of our consciousness blurring, merging with the hum of the mountain. One night, Sarah turned to me. She looked frail, her skin thin as parchment, but her eyes were bright. She told me she was ready. She said she could hear the mountain calling her by name. She didn't want to wait for her body to fail completely. She wanted to step into the song, while she still had the strength to make the choice. We called Julian and Elena. We called Kaylin. They gathered in our quarters, their faces sorrowful but filled with love. There was no panic, no frantic medical intervention. This was the way of the mountain. Sarah lay back on her pillows. She held my hand. She looked at the faces of the people she had led, loved, and saved. She smiled. "It's been a good watch," she whispered. Then she closed her eyes. She began the breathing technique we had practiced. Her breath slowed, deepened, and then, on a long exhale, it simply stopped. But she wasn't gone. In the moment of her passing, a new tone joined the ambient hum of the room. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, a clear, strong note of pure clarity. I felt it vibrate in my chest. I looked at Kaylin, and he nodded, tears streaming down his translucent face. She had done it. She had merged. She was part of the resonance now. We buried her body in the new gardens of the echoing deep, under a canopy of bioluminescent ferns. But we knew she wasn't there. She was in the walls. She was in the air. She was a feeling of peace that settled over you when you walked through the tunnels. I miss her every day. The silence in my quarters is heavy, without her breathing. But when I go to the binding chamber, when I stand on the viewing platform and listen to the great choir singing the earth resonance, I can hear her. She is the high, sweet harmony that cuts through the bass, the thread of silver light in the golden glow. My own time is coming soon. I can feel the weariness in my bones. I am tidying up my affairs, finishing my journals, saying my goodbyes. I am not afraid. I know what waits for me. I know who waits for me. The deep city is in good hands. The expansion is nearly complete. The entity is asleep. The rotation is stable. We have built a sanctuary that will last for millennia. When I close my eyes for the last time, I will not be stepping into the dark. I will be stepping into the music. I will join Sarah and the Watchers and the mountain itself. We will sing the world to sleep, and we will sing the sun up in the morning, unseen and unheard, the eternal guardians of the rock. This is the end of my journal, but it is not the end of the story. The story continues in the stone, in the song, in the breath of every person who walks these halls. If you are reading this, know that you are safe. We are holding the door. This is Elias Thorne. End of watch. Beginning of song. The silence in my quarters after Sarah's departure was not empty. It was filled with a lingering resonance, a vibrating afterimage of the life we had shared. But as the months turned into a year, I realized that my own tether to the physical world was beginning to fray. It wasn't a sensation of decay, but rather one of thinning, as if the heavy canvas of my body was being worn down to reveal the light behind it. I walked the corridors of the echoing deep, and I felt less like an inhabitant and more like a visitor in a house I had built, preparing to hand over the keys. The expansion of the city was nearly complete. The new generation, led by the children who had grown up in the stone, had achieved architectural marvels that Kalen's people had only dreamed of. They had constructed the Great Dome, a massive communal space built over a dormant magma vent. The heat was channeled through veins of crystal in the floor, creating a radiant warmth that allowed tropical trees to grow a mile underground. It was a cathedral of life, humid and green, filled with the sound of water and the quiet conversations of a people at peace. I spent my final days sitting in the Great Dome, watching the community thrive. I watched Julian teaching a group of apprentices how to listen to the structural integrity of the rock. He was old now, his hair gray, but his hands were steady as he touched the walls, reading the stress lines like Braille. I watched Elena walking with the youngest children, teaching them the names of the ferns and the history of the surface world. They looked at her with awe, this woman who carried the memory of the sun. Kalen joined me often on the bench beneath the canopy of giant ferns. We didn't speak much. There was no need. We shared the comfortable silence of two veterans who had survived a long night. One afternoon, he turned to me and placed a hand on my arm. His skin, once cool and distant, felt warm and solid. He told me that the entity was changing. The golden light of the Earth resonance had permeated the singularity so completely that the shadow was no longer fighting. It had entered a state of hibernation, so deep it was indistinguishable from the rock itself. We had not just caged the hunger. We had lulled it into a dreamless sleep. He told me that my work was done. He said it with a finality that brought a wave of relief washing over me. I had held the line. I had kept the watch. And now, the watch could go on without me. I began my preparations. I organized the last of my journals, cataloging the technical specifications of the resonance amplifiers and the recruitment protocols for the surface network. I met with the council, Julian, Elena, and the Elder Watchers, and formally resigned my position. There was no ceremony this time, only a quiet acknowledgement. They knew. They could feel my frequency shifting, aligning with the tone Sarah had become. The night I chose for my departure was the eve of the 75th rotation. The city was quiet. The lights dimmed to a soft amber glow to simulate the surface night. I walked to the binding chamber one last time. I didn't go to the observation deck. I went down the floor to the spiral grooves we had carved into stone so many years ago. The choir was singing. The sound was a physical presence, a warm, heavy blanket that wrapped around me. I could hear the individual voices, the clear soprano of a young woman from the surface, the deep bass of an elder watcher, the complex midtones of the volunteers. But underneath them all, I heard something else. I heard the high, sweet silver thread of Sarah. She was waiting. I sat down in the center of the spiral. Kalen sat across from me, his legs crossed, his eyes closed. Julian and Elena stood at the perimeter, acting as anchors for the transition. I closed my eyes and began the breathing technique. Inhale the earth, exhale the self. I felt the boundaries of my body begin to dissolve. The pain in my joints, the heaviness in my chest, the fatigue that had dogged me for a decade, it all began to fade. It was replaced by a sensation of expansion. I felt my consciousness spreading out, seeping into the floor, flowing along the wave guides, rising up into the crystal cage. I saw the city not with eyes, but with resonance. I felt the heartbeat of every person sleeping in their quarters. I felt the flow of the water in the hydroponic gardens. I felt the slow, tectonic grind of the plates miles below. It was overwhelming in its beauty. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't spoken. It was a vibration that rang in the core of my being. Elias. It was Sarah. It was the mountain. It was the earth. I let go. I released the last grip I had on the name Elias Thorne, on the identity of the ranger, on the memories of the surface. I allowed myself to become a note. The transition was not like falling asleep. It was like waking up. One moment, I was an old man sitting on a stone floor. The next, I was everywhere. I was the vibration in the walls. I was the hum in the air. I was the strength in the shield. I saw Kalen open his eyes and smile, looking right through the space where my body had been. He knew. I was no longer sitting across from him. I was all around him. I merged with the song. I found Sarah in the harmony, a joyous reunion of pure frequency. We wove our consciousness together, a double helix of intent that spiraled around the core. We were the foundation. We were the guardians. We were home. The body of Elias Thorne was buried beside Sarah's in the echoing deep, but Elias Thorne was gone. What remained was a presence, a watchful intelligence that lived in the stone. I watched as the years passed. As the 75th rotation became the 80th, then the 100th, I watched the city grow, evolve, and flourish. I watched the children of the mountain become elders and then join us in song. We are a choir of hundreds now. We are a river of souls flowing through the dark, keeping the world safe. We do not feel time. We only feel the rhythm. The entity sleeps, cradled in our lullaby, and the world above spins on, unaware that its safety is purchased with the love of those who chose to stay. Time is a river, and we are the stones in its bed. From my vantage point within the resonance, I have watched the surface world change in flashes of light and shadow. Seasons blur into a continuous strobe of green and white. Decades pass like the turning of a page. I have seen the forests on the slopes of Mount Shasta burn and regrow. I have seen the towns below expand into cities and shrink back into towns. I have felt the vibrations of distant wars and the quiet hum of eras of peace. Through it all, the deep city has remained a constant. It has become a civilization in its own right, a hidden jewel buried in the crust of the earth. The population has stabilized at around 500 souls, a mix of humans born in the stone, elder watchers, and a steady stream of volunteers from the surface who continue to answer the call. The returned have done their work well. On the surface, the legend of the mountain has evolved. It is no longer just a place for UFO seekers or casual hikers. It has become a pilgrimage site for those seeking a specific kind of silence. There are quiet orders of meditation, schools of acoustic architecture, and retreats that teach the grounding method, all unsuspecting branches of the tree we planted. They don't know about the entity. They don't know about the crystal cage. They only know that when they come to Shasta, they feel a profound, unshakable sense of safety. They feel held. The entity itself has become part of the geology. It has not moved or stirred in 3 centuries. The constant pressure of the earth resonance, amplified by the generations of choir, has calcified it. It is no longer a whole in reality. It is a dense, inert knot of potential energy, as harmless as a diamond buried in coal. Kalen, before he finally allowed himself to fade into the pure energy of the earth, theorized that we had essentially metabolized the threat. We had digested the darkness and turned it into a foundation for light. I still feel the individual lives of the city. I feel the joy of a young couple taking their vows in the Great Dome. I feel the sorrow of a family saying goodbye to a grandmother who has chosen the final harmony. I feel the nervousness of a new recruit walking into the binding chamber for the first time, and I wrap my resonance around them, a comforting blanket to let them know they are not alone. Sarah is always with me. We are not separate entities anymore. We are a dual tone, a major third interval that underpins the entire harmonic structure. We are the memory of the beginning. When the history is taught to the children, the story of the 2 rangers who walked into the rock, we feel their wonder and it amuses us. We were just people. We were just frightened people who decided to do one hard thing. The relationship between the humans and the Watchers has reached a total synthesis. There is no longer a distinction. The children born now are the large, dark eyes of the ancients and the sturdy frames of the surface dwellers. They are a new species, adapted to the deep, guardianed by biology as well as choice. They speak a language that is half words, half tones, a melodic speech that allows them to communicate with the mountain itself. Sometimes I turn my attention outward, away from the city, up through the miles of rock to the surface. I listen to the footsteps on the hiking trails. I hear the heartbeat of a lone camper sleeping under the stars at Bunny Flat. I hear the thoughts of a ranger in a truck, scanning the horizon, wondering about the mysteries of the wilderness. I remember that truck. I remember the smell of the coffee. I remember the fear of the unknown. And I send a pulse of reassurance up through the granite. You are safe. We are here. The project that began with a notebook and a desperate plan has become an eternal institution. We have proven that humanity's capacity for guardianship is infinite. We are not just consumers of the world. We are its immune system. When the threat is great enough, we can become the cure. And so, the vigil continues. It will continue long after the surface civilizations have risen and fallen, long after the names of nations are forgotten. The mountain will stand and the song will ring. If you are listening to this, wherever you are in the world, take a moment to find the silence. Close your eyes. Listen past the noise of the traffic, past the hum of your refrigerator, past the chatter of your own mind. Listen for the deep, slow vibration that lives in the ground beneath your feet. If you hear it, a low, golden hum that makes your chest feel warm, know that it is us. It is the choir of the echoing deep. It is Elias and Sarah, Julian and Elena, Kaylin, and the thousands who followed. We are singing for you. We are holding the door closed so that you can live in the light. And if one day you feel a pull that you cannot explain, if the silence calls to you not as an absence of sound, but as a presence of waiting, if you find yourself driving north, drawn to the white peak of the volcano, come. The door is hidden, but for those who know how to listen, it is never locked. The rotation is eternal, but there is always room for another voice. We are waiting. The coffee is hot, the gardens are green, and the song is beautiful. This is the resonance of Mount Shasta. This is the story of the Watch. And as long as the mountain stands, the story never ends. Be well, be safe, and listen